Welcome to Crossroads, everyone. I'm your host, Joshua Philipp. Today we have with us Sarah and Beth from Pantsuit Politics. They're here to talk to us about their new book, I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening. And so, Sarah and Beth, it's a real pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks for having us.
So, interesting title. The full title is I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening, a guide to grace-filled political conversations. I haven't had a grace-filled political conversation across aisles in quite some time. I'm sure most people haven't. What is your formula for that? Maybe we'll start with Sarah.
I don't know if there's a formula, it's more of a philosophy. I wish we could give someone easy rules to convince the other side or to win every argument, but if that's what you're looking for, I wouldn't recommend our book. Our book is really about working on yourself and thinking through your own values and then going out into the world and let other people work on you. And it's really about being curious and being open-hearted and giving the same sort of benefit of the doubt that you would want to receive.
And Beth, what's your approach? Same kind of viewpoint? Do you have a different angle from it? What's your stance on it?
Sarah and I differ in terms of our philosophy about government, but our philosophy about political conversation is very similar. It's let me work on aligning my own values, go out and practice that with other people, and then come back and do my own work again and just keep rinsing and repeating that cycle, because we really see the opportunity to engage with other people as a chance to further refine our own views and understand ourselves better and become more of who we want to be in the world. Interesting.
And I know both of you come from different sides of the political spectrum. And so I guess, Sarah, how was it working on this book with, of course, Beth, whose viewpoints are different from your own, writing a kind of, political discussion guide, I guess we could call it.
Well, we've been, practicing what we preach for several years before we wrote the book. So we had lots of real world applications, feedback from listeners, disagreements, places where we changed our minds based on our conversations with each other, places where we didn't. And so we had lots of examples to work through as we put the book together. And that was really helpful. But it was also helpful having to articulate what we'd learned. You think that you have formulated your philosophy until you have to actually write it down with another person. Then you learn a whole nother level of depth and complexity when you have to articulate exactly what you were doing.
Beth, one of the points Sarah mentioned was the idea of working on yourself as part of this process. Could you explain that to us?
We think that sometimes political engagement is driven so externally that we forget that our own values really need to be examined in the process. So rather than allowing a political party or a particular candidate to define for you what's important, taking the time to really think through that in the context of your own life, your own values, the teachings that are important to you, what your lived experience tells you about a particular issue, how it affects your neighbors. And so really stepping back from the noise of political media, we think is important. And we think it's important to keep engaging with news and information, but then having that separate space to say, okay, what do I think about this? What does this really mean to me on a regular basis, so that we aren't just parroting what we hear on cable news or Meet the Press, but we're really showing up as ourselves.
That's an important point, the getting away from the political talking points and looking at it from a value standpoint. Is this kind of accurate, Sarah?
Yeah, definitely. I think it is the most helpful, the most illuminating thing you can do. Well, even if I do agree with it strongly, why? Why is that so important to me? And being able to articulate the values behind a policy position, to say, well, this is about my concerns about the government, or this is about my concerns about corporation. Because it's not that having real skepticism of the roles of either institution isn't important, but just being fearful of the government really isn't a value. You can value liberty and you can value freedom, but to just be constantly skeptical and fearful is not really convincing. And when you try to put words to those values, in that sort of way, you learn quickly, oh man, this isn't, I don't know, I can't articulate why this is so important.
So you've mentioned, of course, the idea of working on yourself. How does the idea of being willing and able to listen to viewpoints that might not go along with what you believe? Beth, could you talk about that? What is the process that you kind of recommend for listening to people whose beliefs or values are different from your own?
We talk a lot about the importance of prioritizing the relationship in those conversations. Our book is not intended to give you instructions to just walk around on the street and strike up a chat with a stranger.
Don't do that.
We really want to give people tools within the context of their circles of influence, their family, their friends, organizations that they're a part of. How can you, with people that you already know, you have something in common with, you hopefully have some sort of affection for, bring politics into the conversation in a healthy way? So the first thing is, if you're sitting with your family, you start and end with, we love each other here. We have a common history together. We care about each other. We want to continue these relationships. And so let's talk about the things that are really important in our community where we have some disagreement, but through the lens of wanting to stay together as a unit. We don't need to debate at Thanksgiving dinner. We don't need to emerge having picked a candidate. The family doesn't have to endorse in the primary. You just want to have a good conversation where you learn something about each other, and maybe you learn something about yourself. And as you listen and find things that really provoke strong disagreement, that's a good chance to step back and work on the relationship more. You can say things like, how interesting that we all grew up in this house together and we view this so differently. Why do you think that is?
And Sarah, I know one point that's mentioned is the idea of respecting the dignity of others. That's interesting. Could you explain that to us?
Well, what we don't want to do is, even with the most abhorrent political beliefs, decide that the answer is then to treat the human being who holds that belief as something less than human. We don't condone, obviously, white supremacy or neo-Nazis or any of these belief systems that everybody acknowledges are really harmful and unethical. But discarding the human being because of those beliefs doesn't eliminate or lessen the impact of those beliefs. It just makes us harder. It makes us less empathetic. It makes us, it's how that acts on us when we say, oh, well, that person's garbage. Or because they're a member of the other party and I feel like they're threatening to America, that means I can talk about them or treat them any way I want because they're the enemy. Because the second we decide because of somebody's political opinion, and not just the extreme, I mean, some of the polarization in America comes because we've decided just the fact that somebody is another party from us means that they are against us, that they're the enemy, that they want to destroy America. And therefore, we can talk about them as if they are less than human, treat them less than human. We can certainly talk about them on social media as if they are less than human. And we just believe that if you hold the values of human dignity, and if as people of faith, we believe that every human has dignity that is to be respected, that is not always easy, and there's no exception. Oh, well, except if they attack my identity, or except if they have some sort of abhorrent political belief. There's no exceptions. It doesn't mean we condone, but it does mean that we respect the basic human dignity and we don't dehumanize in response to even dehumanizing beliefs.
And so, Beth, is this, from what I get, it's kind of the idea of looking at the individual rather than judging them with whatever group they may fit in. And this is something we see in a lot of modern politics and a lot of news coverage, is they want to put people into camps and everyone's judged according to whatever that camp's labels are. And, I really do think it is, like Sarah explained, one of the reasons why, maybe why there are so many conflicts in society is we look at the groups rather than the people.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, the groups are not homogenous. You can hardly call someone a Democrat or a Republican and predict what they believe about any number of issues. And that's good. We should embrace that more. I think one of the biggest flaws in our two-party system is that we don't embrace those differences. And so understanding one, you can see a label, but really not understand what's behind it. And then secondly, I think leaning in to find those threads of commonality, even where there are different positions. So an example that Sarah and I offer in the book and elsewhere is that when we talk about healthcare, she and I have very different views on what the government's role in healthcare should be. But for different reasons, we both think one of the most important policy changes we could make right now is eliminating employer-sponsored healthcare. And we come at that from different philosophies, but it is a unifying thread. It gives us a place to go with the conversation. There's something you can do once you identify that kernel of agreement. And I think sometimes in our political discussion, we won't just take those wins. You know, we sort of insist that unless we are in lockstep about absolutely everything, we can't work together. And that's not true, and it's not working for us.
It's interesting. It's kind of like another concept of diversity, which we hear so much about. You know, it's easy to say we like diversity, but when it comes to diversity of opinions, it's not always so easy. What are your thoughts on this, Sarah?
Diversity is challenging, and it should be challenging, or maybe it's not diversity. There needs to be moments where we feel a little unsteady, because that's where we grow. When we have to regain our balance or really articulate how we feel, or even when we feel frustrated. You know, a life full of comfort that's never challenging is not much of a life, in my opinion. I think those moments where we're trying to figure things out and work through our opinions and can't really quite figure out what's bothering us about a situation or somebody's disagreement with us. Those are really important moments to lean into.
And Beth, you touched on some interesting points, which is kind of looking at things, first of all, thinking for yourself, not thinking about things within the boundaries of political talking points, and also looking at things from a stance of values rather than parties. Could you explain this?
Well, I think a helpful example of what we mean when we say values versus parties is to look at a specific issue. So if we talk about climate change, and there's a lot of emotion surrounding it, and the more we talk to people from all perspectives on this topic, we realize that the driving emotion is fear. There is a fear of what could happen to the planet on one side of the aisle, a fear of what could happen to families and the economy on the other side of the aisle. But fear isn't a value, as Sarah said earlier, so we've got to think about what values can animate this discussion. Okay, the value of being good stewards of our planet, the value of caring for our neighbors, of thinking about how everyone will be impacted by each change. You could have values around innovation. So there are lots of ways to reframe this conversation where you recognize the fear. Don't be dismissive of it, because emotions are really important to how we behave in terms of politics. But kind of label that, know that it's driving you, and then think a little bit deeper about, you know, what would I share with my children as our guiding principles as we come to a conversation like this.
Interesting. And Sarah, the issue of emotions is interesting because, you know, emotions are pretty high on both sides of the aisle. Each side likes to say that they're more logical, but really, people are all pretty emotional. And, you know, maybe some less so, of course. You know, some people are pretty logical with it, but the emotions make it difficult, and sometimes people don't want to hear you out. What do you recommend doing in a situation like that?
I think because we decided we shouldn't talk politics for so long, everybody feels really frustrated and unheard. And for better or for worse, right now in American politics, we're at a phase where we're going to have to let people exercise their frustration. There might be a lot of listening before we get to the actual part where we're ready to converse across a spectrum of ideas. And so I just think you have to, when you're listening to somebody who has a lot of emotion about a political topic, know that there is a lot more wrapped up in that there's probably a long expanse of time and experience wrapped up in that. They're not really just with you in this moment. If they're feeling frustrated and unheard, that's probably based on years of experiences. And so we're just going to all have to work through that. And it's going to be hard at first.
That's a very good point. The frustration of being unheard. And I think you really hit it on the head right there. Maybe, Sarah, could you explain that a bit more?
You know, I'm a long-term devotee, as in my entire life, of Oprah Winfrey. And if I learned anything watching that show for decades, it was people need to be heard. People need to be listened to. And so if what we've been doing for decades is saying, well, we're not going to talk about this, or when we do talk about it, we're just going to yell and attack each other, then you have decades of people feeling frustrated, misunderstood, unfairly judged. And that's all going to bubble up anew every time if they never are able to articulate that and to have someone say, I'm sorry you felt like that. I'm sorry you felt judged, or I'm sorry that you felt people were assuming things about you unfairly. I hear you. I felt that too. I felt that in political conversations where people heard one thing and assumed a lot of things about me, and that's very frustrating. We have to hear each other. We have to let people feel affirmed, because they can't get out of that moment if everybody keeps shutting it down and telling them that didn't happen.
And more pragmatically, we can't influence each other if we're not willing to do this work. So if you don't like where your community is or where your family members stand on issues, or even on some of those really kind of hot button, morally challenging and sometimes just outright abhorrent things, we will not rub off on each other if we aren't willing to hear people out and be kind and continue to show up and do that work. And again, this is not going to be like one dramatic conversation where suddenly everyone gets it all out and we're good and we can move on. It is a practice of a little bit here and a little bit there, and over time we are drawn more in each other's directions, and that enables us to hear each other out and shift a bit.
And I'd imagine too that sometimes that first conversation can be the most difficult, or the go.
I think that's right.
Yeah, going to that uncle who you might have argued with on Facebook and shaking hands with them or something like that, right?
Well, and so one thing we would offer about that is just have an exit strategy ahead of time. Like, know before you go into the conversation how you want to wrap it up. I think that's one of the hardest things to leave a discussion. We encourage people to say, let's agree to discuss this again sometime. I've heard you, I need to think about this a little bit, or I feel myself getting kind of hot, and that's not the place I want to be in as we talk about this. So let's take a break. But I'm so glad we discussed it, and I want to come back and do it again.
I could see a lot of this having to come from each person as individuals, being willing to put down their own emotions and their own feelings, and I think maybe care more about what you talked about, the relationship, than they do about the issues. Sarah, could you explain this to us? How you go over this principle?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just prioritize the relationship always. We're not having a debate. We're not winning. Like Beth said, we're not trying to come away from our Thanksgiving table with a primary endorsement. We're not an editorial board. What we're trying to do is learn more about each other, not convince each other. And first of all, you can't convince anybody if you don't understand what they're coming. So even if I can't really get you on board with this learning, like even if ultimately you want to convince that person, great. You can't do it if you don't understand what they're saying. But I think prioritizing the idea that I'm not trying to come out of this conversation feeling self-righteous, like I said everything I wanted to say. I'm more worried about how the other person feels that they don't feel furtherly frustrated, that they don't feel angry that somebody didn't listen to them. Because we've all felt that way, and it's a crappy way to feel. And so we don't want to make people feel like that, especially people we love.
I think one thing that's important to just say is when we say prioritize the relationship, we don't mean abandon your own politics. We think that you can hold these things together where you really strongly disagree with people around you and still see the value of being connected to them in some way, being in community with them. Hopefully at some point there is some thread of their perspective that you find something valuable in, at least in that it sharpens your own convictions. So we never want people to listen to us and hear, we'll be a doormat, and be walked over, or it doesn't really matter enough to have conflict. We just want to move people toward healthy conflict instead of this sort of persistent stalemate that we find ourselves in.
If you were to leave people with kind of if you wanted people to take one message from your book, what would that be?
I think my one takeaway is that you might not be convinced about anything we've said. And if you like the current state of politics in America and you think it's great, fine. But if you don't, if you're not happy with the direction we're heading, then maybe it is time for all of us to try some approaches that make us uncomfortable, that we're not sure will work. And that's what I hope people come to our book and think, for better or for worse, I don't like where we're at, and I'd like for America to be in a different spot. And so I'm willing to at least try to listen, to try to give grace, to be curious, to examine my own beliefs, because it's not working. It's not working.
I really don't want people to tune out or decide that it's hopeless or just abandon the whole process because of the ugliness within it. Our history has been shaped by the people who have done this work and shown up and kept trying, and it can be shaped that way again. We don't have to accept where we are today as just how it is inevitably going to be. And the work that we do in our homes and families matters so much more than it can feel like it matters day to day. So I just want to be there encouraging people to continue this work.
Great. It's a real pleasure having you both on the show. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Great. And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. Click that notification bell. See you next time.